Hi everyone, my name is Alex Holt and I'm a school psychologist with MFNERC. Today we will be presenting a webinar on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children, otherwise known as ADHD. I have my colleague with me, Georgina Moody, who is an MFNERC school psychology intern. So you'll be hearing from her later on in the presentation. So our agenda for today's webinar is to talk about what is ADHD, how does it show up, what else could it be, and now what? So we're hoping to answer these questions by the end. So first, it's helpful to distinguish what is ADHD on a broad scale. So it's a brain-based disorder. It affects attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. It interferes with daily functioning, and it affects about 5% of the childhood population, with that number fluctuating in line with the diagnostic changes. What ADHD is not is a choice. So like I said, it's a brain-based disorder. It is something a child has no control over. It's not being lazy or being bad, and it's not being manipulative, and it's not a sign of low intelligence. So there, just because a child has a diagnosis of ADHD and trouble with their attention does not mean that their general intelligence is low. So those two things might not be as related as we think. So ADHD affects two broad areas. So the first area is inattention. So basically trouble paying attention and focusing on one thing and staying on task. So these are the students that you might notice in the classroom who are easily distracted. They, like I said, have trouble staying on task. It's not necessarily that they can't pay attention, but it's that they have trouble regulating and managing their attention. So they might be able to pay attention really well to one thing, but not necessarily to another thing. So they might be really good at paying attention to a video game, but not as much in the school setting on an academic task. So historically, this was called ADD, so that attention deficit disorder. Now it's all subsumed as part of ADHD. So the second broad area is hyperactivity and impulsivity. So these are the kids that are constantly moving, constantly fidgeting. They talk nonstop. Usually if it's severe, it'll be noticeable early on. So these are the children that often when we're working with them, we feel pretty exhausted by the end. Their behavior can be somewhat disruptive. They seem to need less rest than other children, and sometimes they don't identify dangers, which means that they act in an unsafe way. So these are two broad areas affected, but sometimes we see children who show symptoms from both broad area. So that's where we'll see a combined presentation. So in general, we have three different presentations of ADHD: the inattentive presentation, the hyperactive impulsive, and then the combined presentation. So another way to conceptualize it is through this visual, which I really like. So it talks about the movers, the squirmers, and the daydreamers. So the movers are those active kids, always on the go. The squirmers are those kids that might not get out of their seat, but they're pretty fidgety, constantly moving. You might see them moving around with their hands. And then we see the daydreamers, which are present physically, but mentally seem like they are in another place. So they're kind of daydreaming in the middle of class. So we might also conceptualize ADHD in this way. So when we are thinking of ADHD diagnosis, the assessment is a very comprehensive process. We need information from multiple people and from multiple settings. So for children, that often means collecting information from the home setting as well as the school setting. So we understand how that behavior shows up in each of the different settings. It includes considering the child's developmental age. So if a child is 5 years old and they're bouncing off the walls, that's a little less noticeable and concerning than a child who's 14 and bouncing off the walls all of the time. So we always take that into consideration when we're doing assessment. We also consider the culture or contextual factors, so that might be the expectations that are set out by the culture, as well as contextual factors could be the environment. So are there pieces of the environment that make the child's behavior more severe or less severe, or is there a reason why they're acting in either an inattentive or hyperactive way based on the context in which they're living? We also look at assessing multiple domains. So assessment is not just filling out a questionnaire and diagnosing ADHD. If that's the case, then I would say more information is needed. So for school psychology, when we're doing an assessment, we're looking at intellectual skills, executive functions, which we are going to talk about later on. We're looking at academic skills, attention levels, memory and learning, processing speed, as well as visual processing. So how do they process visual information in their mind, and how quickly do they process that information? So when we're looking at diagnosis as well, diagnosis is based on clear criteria that comes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, otherwise known as the DSM-5. So I'm not going to go through all of this. The reason it's here is to show you we have a number of different criteria that need to be met before we're even considering a diagnosis. So for instance, we need to have persistent symptoms, so that it's not as if the inattention comes up once in a blue moon. It would be that it's persistently always present, as well as having a number of symptoms present. So I'll talk about that in 1 second. We also are looking at seeing several symptoms present before the age of 12. So ADHD is a childhood disorder, which means it shows up in childhood. If we're not seeing any evidence of symptoms and we're actually seeing evidence to the contrary, then we might want to question whether this is really ADHD we are looking at. Sometimes what we do see is that when kids are young, if they have enough support, they won't show those symptoms until later on, and they might not show it until things get really hard in school. And that's when often you'll see more symptoms come out. So that's something we try and take in mind when we're doing the assessment. We also need to see symptoms are present in multiple settings, not just one. We also need to see that there is a clear evidence that the symptoms of ADHD interfere with or reduce quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. So what I would summarize this to mean is if there's no impairment, there's no diagnosis. So we're not calling people's regular behavior a disorder unless it is impairing and harmful to them in some way. So we're not going to start pathologizing what just might be normal childhood behavior unless we have a good reason to. We also need to make sure symptoms are not explained by another disorder or occurring during the course of something like a psychotic disorder. So again, I'm not going to go through all the symptoms because this can be a little bit overwhelming. My point in showing you is that there's specific symptoms we are considering when we're looking at a diagnosis. And so these are the ones that are outlined in that DSM-5 criteria that we use. We need children to show at least 6 symptoms in order to consider a diagnosis. So if a child shows 6 inattentive symptoms, we would consider them potentially having the inattentive presentation. 6 of the hyperactive impulsive, we would consider that presentation. If a child shows 6 symptoms of both, then we would start looking at whether combined presentation is a relevant diagnosis. So the reason why we're so careful and comprehensive in diagnosis is because there's quite a few implications if we are not doing our jobs and we misdiagnose a child. So the first one is implementation of unwarranted treatment. So this means we think a child has ADHD and then we decide to move in a course of treatment that is relevant for ADHD. But if it's not warranted because they don't really have ADHD, we might cause more harm than good. So one example could be medication. Medication can be appropriate for children who have a diagnosis of ADHD, But if it's not appropriate, we might put them at further risk, as well as potentially on medication that has side effects. In addition, we're not getting the needed intervention for the root cause. So if the root cause of the behavior is not ADHD, then we might be missing out on some of the treatment for that root cause. The self-concept can be influenced, so a child now sees themselves as having a disorder that they might not actually have. There's the potential it could affect graduation and future employment opportunities, depending on what kind of field they want to work in. And another piece to think about is the gender differences in presentation and identification. So in general, boys are much more likely to be identified with ADHD than girls. So girls actually are quite underdiagnosed in a lot of cases. The reason being that the presentation we often see in young girls is the more inattentive presentation. What that means is that they're often less disruptive. So we might not notice them, they might fly under the radar a little bit more, and we can sometimes miss those symptoms of ADHD when it comes to girls. So that's something to be really mindful of, but then also being mindful that boys are more likely to be overdiagnosed because they tend to be a little bit more restless and a little bit more hyperactive and disruptive. So that's just something to keep in mind when we are looking at diagnosis. So I really like this quote. It comes from Sparrow and Earhart, which is an essentials book on diagnosing ADHD. So they say diagnosis of ADHD is more than a symptom count. So if that's all we're doing, we're not really doing our job and making sure this is appropriate for that child. So now we're going to move on to the section about how does ADHD show up. So it often affects a number of different areas, with four main ones being cognitive, academic, behavior, and social emotional. So in the cognitive area, we might notice a child can be more forgetful, distracted, having limited focus and follow through on activities. So they might start and get really excited about it, but they have trouble finishing the activity all the way to the end. We might also see difficulty with sequencing, so putting events in order. Sometimes storytelling can come across a little incoherent if they're having trouble putting the right information in the order it needs to be so that you can understand that as the listener. In terms of academic areas, we sometimes see these children having poor attendance. This is because sometimes behavior difficulties get in the way, or if they're having challenges at school, they don't want to come as often. And we might see unfinished work, often being late, disorganized, and losing things. In the behavior domain, we might see children who are more impulsive, daydreaming like we talked about. They tend to be more reckless, maybe blurting things out in class, and more hyperactive, so having trouble sitting still and staying in their seat. In the social emotional area, we might see these children having poorer relationships because of those symptoms get in the way of getting along with others, whether that be children or adults. We tend to see children with ADHD having lower self-esteem. Often these kids are kind of seen as the disruptive kid or sometimes labeled as the bad kid. And that can really affect them in how they see themselves and their self-esteem as they grow up. We see sometimes more negative moods, being worried about or avoiding situations because they know their behavior might get in the way of that, as well as sometimes appearing unengaged because they're having that trouble focusing. So the thing that we mostly see that really pulls together all these affected areas is the executive function difficulties. So executive functions influence and play a role in all of these different areas. So executive functions are basically the boss of the brain. I think of it as an air traffic controller if you're at the airport. So they have a number of responsibilities that involve managing all the different planes, making sure nobody's landing at the same time, making sure nobody's going to crash into each other. So they're basically directing and organizing activities. So your executive functions are responsible for managing your cognitive skills and abilities. So they can be thought of in three main areas. So the first one is working memory and planning, which is the ability to hold information in mind and carry out steps to meet a goal. So if I'm at work one day and someone says, oh, Alex, can you go to the photocopier and can you grab me my pink sheet of paper? I need it back in my office. I have to hold all that information in my mind in order to carry out the task. So that's our working memory and planning ability. So the next one is our cognitive flexibility. So this is our ability to shift between ways of thinking or doing. So if I'm a child and it's recess time and I'm having so much fun and I'm running around, I need to use my cognitive flexibility to shift away from recess and transition back into the classroom in order to move on with my day. And lastly, we have inhibitory control, or otherwise you can think of that as self-control. So being able to ignore distractions and think before acting. So again, if I'm a child and I'm sitting in the classroom and the teacher is teaching, but I have a great idea and I really want to share it, that inhibitory control is my ability to refrain from blurting out my answer and sharing what I want to share. So all of these skills have a lifelong importance, particularly in academic areas. So we actually see that executive functions predict success in school better in some cases than general intelligence. So these are very important skills and abilities, and they actually take until about the mid-20s to develop fully. So most of the students that we are working with are still developing these skills. So I'm just going to show a quick video. It's about 2 minutes. It looks at the Marshmallow task, which is a really good example of executive functioning. So I'll let the video do some of the explanation, but I'm showing it as an example of when these skills might be used.
The Marshmallow Test is a really great way to show how children delay gratification. We tried it out with the 4 children we've been following since September 2010, Alfie, Millie, Mackay, and Pratmesh. Here's how it works. We had each child on their own sit at the table at a desk with a plate and 1 marshmallow. They could either choose to eat the marshmallow, the 1 marshmallow, right then and there, or they could wait until I came back into the room and have 2 marshmallows. I left them alone in the room for 15 minutes. Take a look. The Marshmallow Test has been used for decades by psychologists. It's been used with children to predict later academic success, including literacy, SAT scores, and other academic outcomes. There's no definitive answers from the Marshmallow Test. It's not a matter of passing or failing. What we're looking for is whether children can really resist this piece of white candy sitting in front of them that's sweet, that, the smell of it, the allure of the marshmallow. In Pratmesh's case, we really saw this added curiosity because he had never actually tasted a marshmallow before. All of the children managed to show some level of self-control and resist the temptation to eat the whole marshmallow. As you can see from the footage, you can catch a glimpse into children's ability to control their impulses. This ability, which is developed around the time of kindergarten, can be linked to other outcomes later in life. At the end, the marshmallows were in kind of different states. Some had been squished, ripped apart, nibbled around. There was this temptation and there was this impulse to kind of try it out.
Okay, so like she said, that ability to delay the immediate reward and gratification has long-term implications. If we think of it in school, a lot of times we have to delay that immediate reward in order to focus on the long-term goal of learning and put in that effort. So I think that's a really cute video and good example of what it means to use those executive functions. So to end the section on executive functions, I just wanted to mention that In ADHD, we often see executive functions being impaired in one way or another. So every individual is different, and we'll see strengths and weaknesses within those skill areas we talked about, but we'll almost always see this. However, just because we see executive function difficulties does not mean a child has ADHD. So they can, lots of kids without any disorders can have executive functioning difficulties, but we can also see it show up in diagnoses such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or FASD, autism spectrum disorder, specific learning disorders, anxiety disorders, and mood disorders. So just because we have difficulties doesn't mean that there is a disorder there, but it's often affected in ADHD. So moving into our section on what else could it be. So we've talked about what is ADHD and what it looks like, but we have to consider what else could it be and ask ourselves two questions. So first, does the child meet the criteria for ADHD? The answer is yes. Then, if the criteria is met, are there alternative explanations for symptoms? So like I said before, we have to be comprehensive, and we're not doing our job as school psychologists if we don't look at what else could explain these symptoms of ADHD we're seeing. So I have an activity for us to do. If after the activity you need to pause your video for a second, that's okay. I'm going to present you with 5 different characteristics, and I want you to guess, what kind of job do I have? So the 5 characteristics are: I wear a uniform, I drive a work-issued vehicle with decals on it, I drive above the speed limit, I use a radio, and I work in a team. So if you need to pause the video to think about it and write down your answer, you can do that now. But when we've done this activity in person with people, we get tons of different responses. So 4 jobs I could think off the top of my head that fit this criteria are a policeman, a firefighter, a paramedic, or a race car driver. So just because we have these characteristics and symptoms doesn't mean we can feel confident in identifying what that is. This relates to ADHD because just because it looks like ADHD, it doesn't mean it is. And just because we meet criteria does not mean we are going to diagnose ADHD. So we have to consider the other factors that could be affecting the child. So this isn't, I would say this isn't even a comprehensive list. These are just things that we often see in the students that we work with. So we have to consider sleep, health, and medical issues. So is the child not getting enough sleep, and so they seem really tired and inattentive? Or are they really having, let's say, medical issues like difficulties with their blood sugar levels, which are making them act in a certain way? We have to consider temperament. So some children are just slower to warm up to new situations, while others are a little bit more quick when it comes to things like that. Developmental age, so considering their cognitive level, that's a big reason why we look at intellectual functioning. If a child has some difficulties with their intellectual skills, then we assume that their attention will also be affected, but that's not necessarily meaning they have ADHD. It might actually be appropriate to their cognitive skills. We have to consider sensory issues. So a child could appear impulsive and hyperactive based on the lights in the room or the noises or their clothes. We consider unpredictable caregiving. So if a child does not trust an adult because they don't know them well, or it's a new person to them, they might act in a different way, as well as a mismatch of the child's capacity to the expectations. So if we expect kindergarten students to sit and do a worksheet for like half an hour, the chances are that a lot of those kids are going to have trouble with that. And so we're going to see those more inattentive, hyperactive behaviors, but it's not necessarily because of ADHD. It's just that the expectations might not fit their capabilities. We also have to consider mental health issues. So children who appear anxious often spend time scanning their environment, kind of looking for dangers, preoccupied with worries. So they can look like they're on edge, squirmy, fidgety, when really it's anxiety more than it's ADHD, as well as trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to go into more detail about this one. So adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they're referred to, are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. So there's three main areas. This is abuse, so physical, emotional, or sexual; neglect, which can be physical or emotional; as well as household dysfunction, so mental illness, having an incarcerated relative, a mother that was treated violently, substance abuse in the home, or divorce. So these are events that occur before the age of 18, and research has found, so a large research study found that having having adverse childhood early experiences affect the way our brain develops and can lead to some negative outcomes later in life. So what the study found is that the more adverse experiences you have in your life, the higher the risk is for negative health outcomes. So some of the possible outcomes that we might see relate to behavior and physical and mental health. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but an example might be higher rates of alcoholism and drug use, as well as higher rates of mental health difficulties such as depression, suicide attempts, as well as a number of different physical health issues. So the more adverse experiences you have, the higher the risk. So I find this to be a really startling image. It shows two different brains. So on the left-hand side, we have a child who would have experienced a happy home life. And on the right-hand side, we have a child who experienced extreme neglect and emotional abuse. So what you'll notice is that the left brain is significantly larger. So the right brain has less brain structure to work with, which limits your ability to process information. So a child who has experienced extreme neglect and has less of that brain structure might be more easily triggered emotionally, as well as potentially lacking the skills to develop relationships with adults in a positive way. So it's going to affect the way these children behave. So that's where it becomes really relevant to ADHD. If you have a child who's experienced extreme neglect, they might show some of those behaviors that look like ADHD, when really the root cause of that is that extreme trauma and neglect that they have experienced. So our takeaways around adverse childhood experiences and ADHD is that separating these two components, ADHD and trauma, is very difficult. You can't meet a child once and know right away. It's something that getting to know the child and the circumstances in which that they've grown and developed is really important. This becomes extra important when the trauma occurred at a very early age. That means it affected their brain right away. And so we want to understand that a little bit better. What we would recommend is that treatment occur for trauma first, and then ADHD be considered after there's been some treatment for that. So treatment might look like developing relationships with healthy adults in their community. So it's a tricky thing to distinguish. So we would just leave you with these two key takeaways. So right away, I'm going to pass this over to Georgina.
I'm Georgina. I'll continue. My topic will be on the ADHD symptoms and typical development. Preschoolers have higher levels of ADHD, like behavior, but these behaviors are often temporary and improve naturally over time. There's concern when behavior is excess of what is typical for age and developmental stage, more frequent, severe, and longer lasting. Consider what is typical for their age as opposed to the students in their grade. In a kindergarten class, there can be a full year difference between students depending on their birth date, and it's natural that some will have a better developed attention skill. There's 5 areas of attention that Alex has already mentioned that attention is important. Attention is a skill we develop over time. There are different types of attention. There's focused attention, shifting attention, selective attention, divided attention, and sustained attention. Sometimes students struggle with one type of attention. As you can see in the pictures, the focused attention is when your child is focused on the visual or the auditory or the hearing information. The shifting attention is the child begins one task and stops to shift to focus on another task. Sustained attention is when your child can't attend or can attend and focus on a task for a continuous stretch of time. Selective attention, when your child attends to one specific task while filtering out other distractions around them. The divided attention, when your child can multitask, focusing on a part of their attention on multiple items of at the same time. So what do we do now? Our brain's ability to change in response to other life experiences decreases as we age. At younger ages, our brain is undergoing significant development and is more adaptive to change. Therefore, the amount of effort we put into change increases substantially. It is easier and less costly to form strong brain circuits during the early years than it is to intervene or fix them. Highlights the importance on the importance of early intervention, since we can more easily change and develop skills at a younger age. If you look at the diagram in the blue, this is the brain's ability to change in response to their experiences. On the other side, the amount of effort it takes such change. At the bottom is the age, and as you see from the younger years, it's going up, so the amount of effort is not quite so, or is increasing. And now we look at the strategies. We're going to look at the learning environment and structure and routine. The learning environment in the school, or it could be at home, we want to reduce clutter and unnecessary objects in the working space. We need to use periods of quiet or reduced time or reduced noise. For the structure and routine, we want to maintain a daily schedule with alternating activities. Include short but frequent break in between tasks. Break the large tasks into small steps. These strategies can be applicable to the home or school, and they might need some slight adjustments depending on the setting. Strategies such as these can also be recommended to parents. Another strategy is to increase engagement. Provide opportunities for choice. Give the kids 2 or 3 choices and let them choose one. Present information in multiple ways, such as visual, verbal, tactile, or even musical. Make activities hands-on and include interests. Model and provide the social cues, such as an example before, the timetable. There's a visual timetable. Or if you're doing a academic activity such as writing, have the steps of writing visually for the kids to use. Incorporate movement and multiple modalities. As we mentioned, the visual, verbal, and tactile. And also, we need to emphasize that kids need hands-on. Behavior management. Remind the child of expectations and provide immediate feedback when you see them doing something good or negative. Have movement breaks for them. Set up opportunities for success and catch them being good. Emotion management. Name and notice the emotions. Model for them. Model the emotions for the child or the names of the emotions. Validate and normalize the emotions. Practice the emotion regulation strategies when they're calm. Do deep breathing exercises. Listening to music or going for a walk can help them manage their emotions. The way we talk about children and their behavior matters. We can reframe the way we see the behaviors by changing our language. We change our lenses and eventually our responses. For example, use the first person language. You may think Johnny is ADHD, but instead try saying Johnny has ADHD. State the action, use the verbs. You might think the child is aggressive, but instead try saying, describe the action that the child is doing. Is he kicking, hitting, punching, or spitting? Avoid labels. Johnny's so ADHD. Instead, try saying, Johnny got out of his seat. So in that sentence, we're describing the action he's doing. He got out of his seat. Avoid value judgments. Johnny had a bad day. Instead, try saying, Johnny needed a lot of reminders today. Avoid generalization of behavior. Often we hear people saying, Johnny was so disrespectful. Instead, try saying, Johnny swore at me. So you're describing again the action he did. We have a short video. It's a TED Talk by this lady's Rita Pearson. She's an educator and speaks to the importance of relationships with children and teens. It's very relevant for students with the ADHD due to their behavior difficulties. These students sometimes have trouble managing positive adult relationships. However, this is incredibly important and a powerful strategy for supporting them at home and at school.
I have spent my entire life either at the schoolhouse, on the way to the schoolhouse, or talking about what happens in the schoolhouse. Both my parents were educators. My maternal grandparents were educators. And for the past 40 years, I've done the same thing. And so needless to say, over those years, I've had a chance to look at education reform from a lot of perspectives. Some of those reforms have been good, some of them have been not so good. And we know why kids drop out. We know why kids don't learn. It's either poverty, low attendance, negative peer influences. We know why. But one of the things that we never discuss, or we rarely discuss, is the value and importance of human connection. Relationships. James Comer says that no significant learning can occur without a significant relationship. George Washington Carver says all learning is understanding relationships. Everyone in this room has been affected by a teacher or an adult. For years, I have watched people teach. I have looked at the best and I've looked at some of the worst. A colleague said to me one time, they don't pay me to like the kids. They pay me to teach a lesson. The kids should learn it. I should teach it. They should learn it. Case closed. Well, I said to her, you know, kids don't learn from people they don't like. She said, that's just a bunch of hooey. And I said to her, well, your year is going to be long and arduous, dear. Needless to say, it was. Some people think that you can either have it in you to build a relationship or you don't. I think Stephen Covey had the right idea. He said you ought to just throw in a few simple things, like seeking first to understand as opposed to being understood. Simple things like apologizing. You ever thought about that? Tell a kid you're sorry, they're in shock. I taught a lesson once on ratios. I'm not real good with math, but I was working on it. And I got back and looked at that teacher edition. I taught the whole lesson wrong. So I came back to class the next day and I said, look, guys, I need to apologize. I taught the whole lesson wrong. I'm so sorry. They said, that's okay, Miss Pearson. You were so excited. We just let you go. I have had classes that were so low, so academically deficient that I cried. I wondered, how am I going to take this group in 9 months from where they are to where they need to be? And it was difficult. It was awfully hard. How do I raise the self-esteem of a child and his academic achievement at the same time? One year I came up with a bright idea. I told all my students, you were chosen to be in my class because I am the best teacher and you are the best students. They put us all together so we could show everybody else how to do it. One of the students said, really? I said, really? We have to show the other classes how to do it. So when we walk down the hall, people will notice us. So you can't make noise. You just have to strut. And I gave him a saying to say, I am somebody. I was somebody when I came. I'll be a better somebody when I leave. I am powerful and I am strong. I deserve the education that I get here. I have things to do, people to impress, and places to go. And they said, yeah. You say it long enough, it starts to be a part of you. And so I gave a quiz, 20 questions. Student missed 18. I put a +2 on this paper and a big smiley face. He said, Miss Pearson, is this an F? I said, yes. He said, then why'd you put a smiley face? I said, because you on the roll. You got 2 right, you didn't miss them all. I said, and when we review this, won't you do better? He said, yes, ma'am, I can do better. You see, -18 sucks all the life out of you. +2 said, I ain't all bad. For years, I watched my mother take the time at recess to review, go on home visits in the afternoon. buy combs and brushes and peanut butter and crackers to put in her desk drawer for kids that needed to eat, and a washcloth and some soap for the kids who didn't smell so good. See, it's hard to teach kids who stink. And kids can be cruel. And so she kept those things in her desk, and years later, after she retired, I watched some of those same kids come through and say to her, you know, Miss Walker, you made a difference in my life. You made it work for me. You made me feel like I was somebody when I knew at the bottom I wasn't. And I want you to just see what I've become. And when my mama died 2 years ago at 92, there were so many former students at her funeral. It brought tears to my eyes, not because she was gone, but because she left a legacy of relationships that could never disappear. Can we stand to have more relationships? Absolutely. Will you like all your children? Of course not. And you know your toughest kids are never absent. Never. You won't like them all, and the tough ones show up for a reason. It's the connection, it's the relationships. And while you won't like them all, the key is they can never, ever know it. So teachers become great actors and great actresses, and we come to work when we don't feel like it, and we listen to policy that doesn't make sense, and we teach anyway. We teach anyway because that's what we do. Teaching and learning should bring joy. How powerful would our world be if we had kids who were not afraid to take risks, who were not afraid to think, and who had a champion? Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists that they become the best that they can possibly be. Is this job tough? You betcha. Oh God, you betcha. But it is not impossible. We can do this. We're educators. We're born to make a difference. Thank you so much.
That was a good, it's one of our favorite YouTube movies. And remember, we need to remind ourselves that I know I'm a retired educator, and we need to be cognizant of that, how we treat the kids, and to build that strong relationship with them. So I'll take it over, give it back to Alex, and she's going to finish off the video. Thank you.
So we're almost at the end. I'm just going to highlight some of our key takeaways to end the presentation. So our first one being ADHD is a brain-based disorder that affects attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So those broad areas we talked about. A comprehensive diagnosis is more than a symptom count. So it's going to take some time, but it's going to allow us to get to the bottom of things. Executive functions are vital, and they take until adulthood to develop. Other factors to consider in an ADHD diagnosis include the ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, other disorders it could be, as well as the child's age. And then our strategies, early intervention is critical and possible. So the earlier we intervene, the better off children typically are. So these are 3 online resources that we wanted to recommend. So the first is Strategies for Executive Functions. I really like this resource because it breaks things up into specific age groups if you're interested. The Canadian ADHD Resource Alliance, so CADRA, is a wonderful website that has credible information on ADHD if you are looking to learn a little bit more. We also wanted to recommend this video that's on YouTube. It's around helping children understand their emotions. So Georgina spoke a little bit about the social emotion management needs of children with ADHD. This is a great video to watch if you want to know a little bit more about how to talk to kids about that. And then these are just some of our references from the things we included at the beginning. And this is our contact information. So please feel free to reach out by email if you have any questions or concerns, feedback, anything like that. We're here to help. So please feel free to connect if you need it. And so thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar.
Thank you.